Good evening, kiddos. Dad is back, and I just want to give you this rant. Now, this rant was originally written in March of 2026, but I needed to make some tweaks to it to make it more accurate and more able for you to hear it. So the title of this is The Rise of Asymmetrical Warfare from a Christian Perspective. So if you're reading this, please note, any underlined words are hyperlinked so that you can do a deeper dive on the topic at hand if you would like. As always, if you like what you hear, be sure to share. If you love what you hear, hit the subscribe button. It's free and helps me do a whole lot more of these. So now that we have that out of the way, let old Dad rant. So let's start this rant with a biblical reference. It just seems apropos. From Matthew 24:6, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." So let me begin this rant with a flat assertion, and my flat assertion is this: that great powers are always at war. That's my flat assertion. Everything else I say in this rant is designed to provide you with the evidence to support that flat assertion. For reasons that will become evident to you as I rant, it is very important that you understand that that flat assertion I just made is an axiomatic universal truth. It was true when the Assyrian Empire defeated Babylon in 612 BC. It was true when the Persians defeated the Greeks at Thermopylae in 480 BC. It was true when the British defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. It was true when the Allies defeated the Axis in 1945. Now, those wars are what we call kinetic wars, meaning there was physical destruction that took place. People had different uniforms, different flags. You knew who was fighting who. Asymmetrical war is war by any other means. In asymmetrical war, the physical destruction is not evident like a kinetic war. However, that doesn't make asymmetrical war any less lethal than kinetic war. In fact, I think the case can be made that asymmetrical war is far more lethal in the long term than kinetic war. Let me provide a little more background on kinetic war before I begin to discuss asymmetrical war. So World War I began in 1914 and famously ended on Armistice Day on the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month of 1918. World War I was unique in all of human history up to that point for two reasons. The first reason is that this was the first industrial age war where modern machinery inflicted mass destruction on a scale never seen before. The American Civil War of 1860 to 1865 and the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 gave us an early glimpse into the carnage that could be inflicted by mechanized warfare, because that was when the hand-crank machine gun was first used. But that was only a glimpse. Here are some quick and dirty facts that will illustrate the carnage of the mechanized warfare of World War I. At the Battle of the Somme, the British lost 19,000 soldiers on the first day of the battle. At Verdun, the French and the Germans combined to kill 300,000 soldiers in 302 days. At the Battle of the Marne, the French and Germans combined to create roughly 500,000 casualties in 7 days. Prior to World War I, the worst battle in terms of lives lost was at Lepanto in 1571, where the Ottoman Empire hooked up with the Holy League to take out 35,000 combatants in a pre-industrial battle royale that lasted about 3 hours. The second reason that World War I was unique was that it was the first time in human history that the human race had engaged in total war. Now, let me explain what I mean by total war. In all of human history prior to World War I, war consisted primarily of soldiers fighting other soldiers. The objective of war was to defeat the other country's army or navy. World War I was the first war in human history where the objective was to defeat not just the enemy's army or navy, but its entire war-fighting capability. Here's the logic. If the civilians are making the weapons, then they are a military target. If the civilians are farmers and feed the enemy's army or navy, then that makes them a military target. World War I was the first time in human history where, on a grand scale, the objective of the combatants was to destroy both the military and the civilian population of the enemy to win the war. As the first post-industrial revolution war, World War I produced a total of roughly 40 million military and civilian casualties, with roughly 20 million people killed. Of course, Hitler, Stalin, Tojo, Mussolini, Churchill, and Roosevelt took this to the next level in World War II. Churchill firebombed Dresden, Roosevelt firebombed Tokyo, Tojo raped and destroyed Nanking, Hitler bombed London, and not to be outdone, of course, was Stalin. Before World War II even started, this monster called Stalin starved 6 million Ukrainians to death. I wonder why present-day Ukrainians might have an issue with Russia, by the way. Stalin then proceeded to have 22,000 members of the Polish intelligentsia machine gunned to death at the Kenyan Forest massacre. Now that you have that background, it's a good time to introduce the concept of asymmetrical warfare. The best working definition of asymmetrical warfare is this: any warfare that is not kinetic. It's the destruction of the enemy by any means other than traditional warfare. Traditional warfare involves the use of guns, submarines, aircraft carriers, tanks, etc., right? Asymmetrical warfare doesn't involve the use of any of that stuff. But as I shall describe in a minute, it is every bit as lethal and in many ways more lethal than kinetic war. Asymmetrical warfare has always been around. Odysseus famously used a form of asymmetrical warfare to fool King Priam of Troy and allow the entry of the Trojan horse into the gates of Troy, leading to the downfall of the city-state at the hands of the Greeks. Prior to 1945, asymmetrical war was used to assist kinetic war. But the day that Truman dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, asymmetrical warfare took primacy over kinetic war. The reason for that change is that kinetic war has suddenly become too dangerous for the great powers. True, the second and third tier countries that don't possess nuclear weapons can continue to engage in kinetic war. The winners and losers in these second tier countries don't risk oblivion if they win or lose. But first tier countries that possess nuclear weapons face total oblivion if they engage in head-to-head kinetic combat. So winning a nuclear war is the ultimate definition of a Pyrrhic victory. The nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States in the 70s would have resulted in roughly 500 million people lost in the immediate exchange, followed by an epic nuclear winter for the rest of the world, and the inevitable mass starvation and civil war for those lucky enough to survive the initial exchange. So kinetic war among first-tier powers is no longer an option. So first-tier countries, and for the purposes of this rant, I define first-tier countries as those that have nuclear weapons. For these countries, it is no longer viable to get into a kinetic war with another first-tier country. The next time first-tier countries get into a kinetic World War I, a World War II style war, it will be the end of mankind. It's as simple as that, and too horrible to contemplate, except for the madmen who rule the Middle East. Officially, those first-tier countries are at the moment the United States, France, Germany, Great Britain, China, Russia, India, and Pakistan. Unofficially, you would have to include Israel in that mix as well, unless you are delusional enough to think that Israel doesn't have a nuclear weapon. Then there is Japan. I just don't believe that the world's second or third wealthiest country in terms of GDP doesn't also have a nuclear weapon or the ability to get one in about 15 minutes. That neighborhood is just too rough to live without a nuclear capability, and I'd probably say the same thing about Taiwan. So those countries cannot engage in a kinetic war with each other ever again. The stakes are just too high. Since 1945, however, they can and they do increasingly engage in asymmetrical warfare against each other because that's the only option available to them, right? So note, declared wars are an anachronism from a bygone era. I think this is interesting. Consider this. The United States hasn't declared war on any other country since 1941 when it declared war on Japan and Germany. But I would submit to you that we've had a ton of conflicts since then, every one of them undeclared. So declared wars are for kinetic wars. Asymmetrical wars are never declared because declaring war would give away the game. Before doing a deeper dive, it is useful to define the enemies of the West and the West itself. The West I'll define as any country with some version of a constitutional form of government. The enemies of the West are best defined in two buckets: domestic enemies and foreign enemies. By far, the most dangerous of these enemies are those of the domestic variety because you can't see them coming. They will always do asymmetrical war. The domestic enemy can be loosely defined as the progressive elite. This is the leadership class that currently runs the United States and all the countries in NATO. These people fundamentally believe that they are smarter than everyone else, and therefore they should tell everyone else how to live. They do not believe in the constitutional form of government and ultimately seek a one-world government. The domestic enemies of the West have been engaged in a 40-year asymmetrical war against the institutions that support constitutional forms of government. The only domestic Tier 1 government that can be defined as an enemy is China. By Tier 1, I mean countries that possess nuclear weapons. There are many non-nuclear countries that can be defined as an enemy, but the only one that is an existential threat is China. Russia is a Tier 1 threat for Western Europe, but not for the United States. Just for kicks and giggles, let's walk through some examples of the categories of asymmetrical warfare. Where possible, I will provide some specific examples. Category 1 is the proxy war. The proxy war is a means of fighting your adversary indirectly by assisting your adversary's second-tier enemy. The purpose is to weaken your enemy without weakening yourself. It's cold, it's heartless, and it's immoral in as much as the second-tier enemy is always a smaller, weaker country that will bear the brunt of the civilian and military casualties. But to the first-tier masters of the universe, they simply don't give a damn as long as it advances their cause. Some classic examples of the proxy war include the Soviet Union fighting the United States using Vietnam as the proxy in the 60s, the United States fighting the Soviet Union using Afghanistan as a proxy in the 80s, and NATO fighting Russia using Ukraine as a proxy right now. The proxy state always suffers the worst in these wars. Vietnam lost roughly 1 million civilians and soldiers during their proxy war against the United States. The Afghans lost roughly 2 million civilians and soldiers during their proxy war against the Soviet Union. In the current proxy war against NATO, Ukraine has lost roughly 80,000 killed and about 400,000 wounded. I can't resist an interesting historical rabbit hole. I just can't help myself. I love history. The United States owes its very existence to a proxy war. The French didn't help the United States to defeat the British during the Revolutionary War from the kindness of their hearts or for a love of freedom, like they taught us in the history books. The French helped the United States defeat the British in order to weaken the British, but in the course of doing this, they weakened themselves. The French went into so much debt fighting the British that they had to sell the entire center of the United States, which we call the Louisiana Purchase, for essentially pennies in the dollar just to keep the country afloat. But alas, it wasn't enough. The country eventually went bankrupt, leading to near starvation conditions in France, the beheading of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and the French Revolution. From the French Revolution, we get the guillotine, the Jacobins, Maximilien Robespierre, Georges Danton, Jean-Paul Marat, and then Napoleon. Wow, when things go bad, they really go bad. Now, you would think that the lesson of King Louis XVI would be a warning to the benighted masters of the universe. Sometimes proxy wars don't play out as planned. On the other hand, sometimes they work brilliantly. In the case of the American proxy war against Russia using Afghans as the pawn, the Soviet Union was so bankrupted by this war that the country collapsed in 1991. So it can work the other way too. Second category, the electoral system. In the West, the dominant forms of government are closely linked to the electoral system. The American form of government is the constitutional republic. The British form of government is the constitutional monarchy. The Italian form of government is the parliamentary republic. What they have in common is that they are dependent on a functioning election system. Sophisticated combatants, both foreign and domestic, understand that this is a serious strategic weakness from a military perspective. If you are a first-tier power, kinetic war against another first-tier power is simply not an option. However, attacking the election system is fair game. Even a second-tier power can conduct war against a first-tier power by attacking the electoral system of the first-tier power. And the beauty of it is an undeclared act of war. In asymmetrical war, the antagonist can always claim innocence. In kinetic war, this claim cannot be made. The Russians have so mastered this strategy that they have a term for it called maskirovka. Remember my rant on that from a couple of years ago, right? The American election of 2020 was obviously an example of an attack on the electoral system by enemies, foreign and domestic. Remember the Venezuelan link to the Smartmatic voting machine? And you silly rabbits thought that Trump took down Maduro just because of drug trafficking and oil. I suspect the bigger reason was because of the Venezuelan asymmetrical attack on the electrical system back in 2020. That's Dad's guess. I might be wrong, but homie don't think so. Category 3, the family. In the West, the dominant forms of government are all constitutionally by nature involve the consent of the governed. If the governed are to be involved in their governance, they must possess the capacity to reason and the discipline to exercise reason. If too many of the citizens in a constitutional form of government lack the capacity to reason, then they will elect too many people who lack the capacity to reason or think, and the government will collapse. The primary vehicle for developing human beings to develop the capacity to reason is the family. The two-parent family consisting of a mother and a father is the best vehicle known to man to take a child from selfish savage to selfless adult. It is through this vehicle that men learn to postpone gratification and engage in reason and not act out of emotion. That's called self-governance. When this vehicle is destroyed, the constitutional form of government will collapse because a man who can't govern himself sure as hell can't govern others. In the United States, you now have an illegitimacy rate in excess of 40%. In many communities, children live without dads are now the norm. The country's enemies, foreign and domestic, have instituted policies and strategies designed to destroy the family. Those are too numerous to outline here, but just note that's a form of asymmetrical warfare. Then there's religion. In the West, the dominant religion has been Judeo-Christianity. I just described the role of the family in taking a child from savage to saint, in moving a child from vice towards virtue. A constitutional republic cannot survive a vicious people. It must have a virtuous people to survive. The best vehicle to inform or coach the parents in teaching their children virtue is the church. If the church is destroyed, the vehicle for transmitting virtue is also destroyed. Over time, the parents' ability to transmit virtue will become destroyed because the parents themselves will no longer know virtue. We now have a church attendance at less than 50% on any given Sunday in the United States. In the 40s, that number was around 80%. It is much worse in Europe. Know that the trend is not accidental. Know that this is due to a strategic attack by the West's enemies, foreign and domestic. The evidence is everywhere. One needs to only look. Organizations like Planned Parenthood and Black Lives Matter are openly anti-family and anti-religion. The public education system, and especially the post-secondary educational system, is rabidly anti-Christian. Communists have always and everywhere and at all times been anti-religion. Remember Karl Marx's famous adage, religion is the opiate of the people? Hollywood has been an anti-family, anti-Christian cesspool since the 60s. This, my friends, is not accidental, that's strategic, and it's asymmetrical. Category 5 would be illegal immigration. The fundamental principle necessary for constitutional republics to work is that its citizens adhere to the rule of law. Illegal immigration is anathema to that principle because illegal immigration is, well, illegal. It is by nature a violation of the law, and people who violate the first law of the country can't be expected to follow or respect the rest of the laws. But that's not the biggest problem. It's an important problem, but it ain't the most important problem. The problem most often cited by opponents of illegal immigration is the economic pressure that illegal immigrants bring to bear on the host country. This is without a doubt a huge problem, and it's the most visible problem. The educational system, the medical system, the judicial system, housing system, and the social welfare systems are completely overwhelmed by large influx of illegals. These systems are barely able to take care of naturalized citizens. The financial and social costs of taking care of millions of illegal immigrants will push the system to the breaking point. But even that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem with illegal immigration has to do with the culture they are leaving behind to come to the host country. The culture of the West is Judeo-Christian. Judeo-Christianity as a moral code is perfectly compatible with constitutional forms of government. Consider this biblical passage from Mark 2:17. And Jesus said to them, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but render unto God the things that are God's." Then consider the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Judeo-Christianity does not demand a state religion. It demands a moral people. A self-governing people can't self-govern if those people are without morality or virtue. The compatibility between Christianity and a constitutional republic are so profound that one wonders if it's supernatural. Nah, it couldn't be. It is self-evident that immigrants from Judeo-Christian cultures will assimilate more easily than immigrants from non-Judeo-Christian cultures. The practitioner of asymmetrical war knows this distinction, and therefore they will seek not just to drive illegal immigration, but to drive it from the East or from countries that are not Judeo-Christian. This is why the current immigration disaster in Europe is a much greater existential threat than the immigration disaster in the United States. Illegal migrants from our southern border are largely coming from Judeo-Christian Mexico and South America. Illegal immigration coming into Europe is coming from Islamic Middle East. Islam and Judeo-Christianity are simply incompatible and cannot coexist in the same country. It's never worked historically, and it ain't going to work now. Europe's enemies, foreign and domestic, have been driving massive immigration from the Middle East for at least the last 10 years. This is one of the most obvious asymmetrical warfare moves that is currently in play. The sixth category, I'll call it the laundry list. In order to avoid writing a book with this rant, I will simply list the following institutional systems that have been under asymmetrical attack in the West for the past 40 years. Your observant munchkins, you'll immediately recognize the truth in this assertion. The rise of drug cartels. The Chinese introduced fentanyl into the United States via the utilization of drug cartels. And it's just brilliant. A historical repeat. The Brits introduced opium into China to destroy that country in the 17th and 18th centuries, and that worked brilliantly. Nothing new under the sun, to quote King Solomon. The domestic enemy's destruction of the educational system will be the next one. We have university graduates who can't spell cat if you spotted them the C and the A, but they know BLM, CRT, DEI, Antifa, LGBTQ, and every other manifestly anti-civilizational philosophy developed in the last 100 years. That they know. The third, or C, the domestic enemy's destruction of the healthcare system. That many state governments actually mandated that its citizens inject untested substances into their bodies continues to boggle the mind. That many state governments and businesses mandated the wearing of masks is equally mind-boggling. That vaccines remain the only class of products in the United States that are shielded from liability is itself a crime. It will take decades for the healthcare system to recover the trust lost from that maneuver. Biological warfare. It is probably a pretty good guess that China launched a biological weapon against the West by introducing COVID to the U.S. population, or the world population. It is also probably a pretty good guess that even if it was an accident that occurred in China, the West's domestic enemies took advantage of this opportunity to destroy the West and usher in a new age of one world government. Asymmetrical warfare, baby. And the food supply. Many people have already forgotten about those mysterious fires at farms and food warehouses that occurred during the COVID crisis. And many aren't aware of how the food supply has changed radically in the past 50 years due to the introduction of untested preservatives. Boomers think the millennial kids are just fat slobs. But could it be that they've been eating food that is radically different from the food that boomers ate when they were kids? Be skeptical. Be very skeptical. How about the forest and urban fires? We experienced a tremendous increase in the number of fires, both urban and rural. Many of these fires were intentionally set by terrorists, funded and supported by our domestic enemies. How do you spell USAID, by the way? Energy supply warfare. What country in recorded history has ever possessed the energy resources necessary to take care of itself, but yet refused to utilize those resources? The United States may be the first country in history to accomplish this ignoble feat. Our last president shut down the building of a pipeline, took millions of acres offline for drilling, and refused to offshore drilling and open Anwar to Alaska. These are the actions of a domestic enemy, plain and simple. On second thought, Western Europe has been and is currently doing the same thing. Western Europe is in fact dependent on its mortal enemy Russia for its energy. Like, how stupid is that? Or how brilliant is that if it's an asymmetrical warfare move? It is either stupid or brilliant, depending on your perspective. It's brilliant if it's an act of asymmetrical warfare by Europe's master class elites. Traitors. No discussion of asymmetrical warfare will be complete without touching on the world's great traitors. Every country at every time in human history has participated in this form of asymmetrical warfare. A short list from relatively recent history includes Norway's Vidkun Quisling and the French Prime Minister Pierre Laval, both of whom collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. American Benedict Arnold, who collaborated with the British during the Revolutionary War, and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who collaborated with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Mata Hari, the famous World War I seductress and traitor, and Kim Philby, the British double agent for the USSR. I apologize, Munchkins. During homeschool, we didn't spend much time on the great traitors. But now that you're grown, this is a rabbit hole that you got to pursue on your own, especially Mata Hari. Dude, that's a story you can't make up. Axis Sally was employed by the Nazis to promote Axis propaganda to the U.S. troops during World War II. Tokyo Rose was employed by the Japanese to do the same to U.S. troops in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Remember when it was Greek traitor Ephialtes who gave the Persians information that led to the defeat of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae? Of course, I'd be remiss if I forgot that our very own Vietnam War traitor actress Hanoi Jane Fonda. There is no end to the list of targets that are available in asymmetrical warfare. In September of 22, Russia's Nord Stream pipeline mysteriously exploded. Nobody took responsibility for it. Obviously, only 2 or 3 countries in the world possess the technology to make that happen. You don't have to be Dick Tracy to guess we did it. Then in March of 2024, a Singapore-flagged tanker ship mysteriously crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, causing the bridge to collapse and blocking a port vital to the energy distribution on the East Coast. Again, nobody took responsibility for this accident. Now I was born at night, but not last night. My money is that the Ruskies paid back the CIA for blowing up their pipeline. We may never know for sure, but That's a pretty good guess. But know this, that is how the asymmetrical warfare game is played. Russia and America are two Tier 1 nuclear powers. Kinetic war between these two countries is suicidal. More asymmetrical war of the variety I just described is what you can expect moving forward. Now, I began this rant with the flat assertion that great powers are always at war. I hope that I provided you with enough evidence to support that flat assertion. While I began this rant with a biblical passage, it seems apropos that I end it with a biblical passage. Quote from Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Peace out and Imago Dei.